Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we have 20 minutes for questions and the answers of the lecturers.
Do you want us to like raise a hand or something to ask a question, or raise a virtual hand?
Yes, you can raise this virtually hand if you can find this, or the floor is yours if you want to ask something. I have one question to Robert. Robert, can you tell me a bit about the Hungarian reception of the James Bond movies, which were kind of products of the Cold War? As I know, the first James Bond movie, which was presented in Hungarian film theaters, was the License to Kill with Timothy Dalton, only in 1989, so in the year of the transition. Is there any cultural debate about the import of these cult movies?
Okay, Peter, then perhaps I will answer your question shortly, and then as the word is with me, I turn to the other two presenters with some remarks and questions. Is that okay?
Yes.
Right. So there was one James Bond movie shown in Hungarian cinemas. It's when the evil is a communist, and it's not easy to represent it to the Hungarian audience in the 60s or 70s. But when the evil is not the Soviet Empire or a Soviet agent or anything, then perhaps an exception can be made, but not an official, or I mean, not a regular exception. So James Bond movies were not shown on regular program of the cinemas. But one James Bond movie in the late 60s, if I'm not wrong, was let in on an English cinema week. So only for a very limited occasion and for a very limited audience, without again much publicity. That was allowed. Then what can we say? Under 1,000 people could watch that James Bond movie in the Hungarian cinema. Usually these were shown, these national cinema weeks were in film theater. So in one film theater in Budapest, it's called Film Museum, and Film Museum had thematic sessions for example, famous Western authors like Godard, like the French New Wave, or for example, Ingmar Bergman. So these were occasions where films that were not in regular circulation could be seen. And that was the case with one James Bond movie as well. So some remarks and questions first to Theodora. She spoke a lot about representing Bulgarian culture as part of universal human culture and showing it that a communist country can be a place of culture that is up to Western cultures as well. This is something we can read about the Soviet term kulturnost. So at the very beginning, I feel the same thing with Hungarian culture. So national folk ensembles travel to the West. Or my favorite example is that in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s, the first big cultural exhibition, artistic, of fine arts to the West, to Britain, and then later shown in France, was a cultural exhibition of Hungarian art in the Middle Ages. So showing up that it's a long culture with deep roots, a renaissance, to show that we are part of Europe. We had been part of Europe before. And this was kind that they did not bring socialist culture first. And it was much harder to bring. So, and much harder to attract audience for such occasions as well. Also, showing up tradition. So when they sent under this logo cultural groups to the West, it was also showing tradition. So folk companies at the very beginning were very important elements to showing up that we are rooted in tradition. So we are not barbarian Huns in the middle of Europe. Like in 1958, a very crucial political moment after the execution of Imre Nagy. 2 weeks after, a folk company went to Wales for a folk competition in the middle of a total political isolation, and it was regarded in the party as a huge political success to win this competition in those circumstances. Also about both Evgeniya and Theodora spoke about the different interpretation of culture, culture of market and culture of state direction. In the Helsinki talks with culture, it always comes up when Hungarians go with an idea, like with television. Okay, we want to do something in this basketry with mutual understanding and knowing each other. Let's make thematic national cultural evenings in television. And then Western televisions answer that, or Western governments answer that, sorry, the televisions are independent, we can't do anything, so let's manage it with them. The televisions say, okay, we are independent, but we are artistic and program policy does not allow such programs. Some countries did, for example, with Germany, with West Germany, these national evenings worked. Also, Theodora mentioned 60 agreements, bilateral agreements, cultural agreements from Bulgaria. Yeah, with most non-socialist countries, these agreements existed in the case of Hungary as well. But as far as I see, these were kind of tools of limiting relations as well, because official channels meant controlled channels. So when we have an agreement with a Western country, that's an achievement also to control contacts. And the game was always about going behind these agreements from the Western side, like inviting authors, writers, either to embassies, to programs of embassies, or offering visits, offering grants outside these agreements. And my question maybe also about, further you spoke about these controlled official channels. What was the situation in Bulgaria with the not also controlled, but a bit more spontaneous, or not spontaneous field, but in Hungary, a bit more open field, the cultural import. So how it worked, because in the Hungarian case, a very large proportion of book publishing, cinema program, theater program was made up from Western products. And if not the percentage of the program, but the percentage of the audience was higher. So, for example, in cinemas, okay, only the 30–40% of the titles were from the West, But finally, the 60, 70, 80% of the audience visited Western products in cinemas, for example. To the question of music and this bureaucratic apparatus, in Hungary, we also had a kind of bureaucratic organization like Mezinárodnyi Kriga. I tried to translate Szerzői Jogvédő Iroda. It was something like Office for the Representation of Artistic Rights in Hungary, and everything went through it. We had, for example, instead of oyster, fisheronni to export. And also I would like to ask if not only recordings, what about music sheets and scores? Because in Hungary, it was also a question of exporting or making currency from music scores. And could a positive balance be achieved? If it was for currency, could a positive balance be achieved, at least in music, for Russian-Western export-import relations? Thank you very much.
So I think in terms of scores were also a thing, and actually started with scores first, like in the late 1940s after the Second World War, and then it went on to recordings. But if you think about it, scores could never be the same volume as recordings, because recordings were, if I talk to older people here in the UK and I tell them the names or I tell them about these recordings, they're like, yes, yes, I have one. So everyone almost had the Soviet Army Choir in their home, or a Shostakovich symphony. The volume of those recordings was just amazing. It was like, every cultured person had some kind of Soviet recording in their home, or a Soviet recording with a Soviet musician or on it. So I think in terms of the volume, the amount of money made from recordings is just so much more than you could ever make from scores. I'm afraid I don't know much about books, or because it was also Международная книга, because the original kniga means book. So they originally started with books and scores, and then they moved on to recordings. I don't know what the situation was with books, but I would always think that because music is the instrumental, there's so much more instrumental aspect to music, classical music. It's always easier to sell it, and also the Soviet Union would have been more open to selling, to exporting a whole variety of composers, not just Soviet composers, but Russian, Tchaikovsky, and they didn't do much like they would do a bit of Glinka, which was like the earliest they would go. So there was no there wasn't much, say, religious choirs or things like that. That was quite unusual. That wouldn't happen. But it's still, the volume was so much more for recordings than for scores, for sure.
So I'll just say very quickly, I mean, there's a lot to talk about here, but I really liked, Robert, the way you spoke about this difference between the culture of the state versus culture of the market. And also, what is between those, right? And Evgeniya spoke about that, right? I mean, you have these hybrid relationships that navigate these different worlds. And I mean, for the Bulgarians, and again, I want to say that I'm talking mostly about the state conceptions of culture, but for the Bulgarians, they have this understanding that there is something that they called true arts, istinsko iskustvo, right? So the true arts versus vulgar mass culture in the West. And, vulgar mass culture is this culture of the market. And they wanted to control it. And one way of controlling is, as I mentioned, through controlling information, to controlling advertisement, to controlling audiences who can get the ticket, who can get an invitation, and limiting the people who can actually go see those more spontaneous events those events were by invitation. So you can't just go buy a ticket, but someone has to give you that invitation so that then you can go see the exhibition of Western German, art, or, Western German movies. Again, I'm talking here mostly about late 70s, early 1980s. I think in the late 80s, things started to change. But on the topic of film, Star Wars came to Bulgaria very soon after it was released in 1977. But when I actually reviewed the negotiations over the release of the movie, it was such an elaborate and staged affair. There were 14 political commissars sent to the embassy of the United States to view the movie together with interpreters and to decide whether it can be released. Right. But then I can tell you, because I remember that I was also in the line trying to get the tickets to see the movie. So I think, again, this conflict between what is the state perception, what is the more spontaneous perception was always there, always this tension. But I think that what I'm noticing in my research on the relationship between Bulgaria and the West, and I think Evgeniya actually made this clear too, is that the focus here was on quality rather than quantity. We want to send our best musicians, our best exhibitions, our best folk ensembles, right? Because we have to wow them. And we want, and that is again connected to the state perceptions of culture, because culture is connected to ideology, and it is connected to this understanding of how society functions, how human rights are understood in socialist countries. So it's a very meticulously managed message, but then it also has these more spontaneous outcomes for sure that don't necessarily follow ideology.
Thank you very much. And I guess Péter Majoros have questions or remarks for the discussion. Péter.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Péter Majoros. I'm a PhD student at Attila University, and I'm studying this period of the history. I have two questions for Mr. Róbert Takács and Mrs. Theodora Dragostinova. It's the same question for you both. My first question is, could we see or interpret this cultural opening process as a part of a regional competition between the socialist or state capitalist states or circles for the sympathy of the capitalist states, so-called often as the West? And my second question is, how reacted the Hungarian or the Bulgarian dissident groups or circles to the cultural openings of their own past or home country? They helped this cultural opening. They attended in any kind of organization, or they have participated, or they just boycotted. So thank you very much for the possibility of question, and thank you for your lecture. It was quite interesting. Thank you.
Robert, shall I go? Thank you. So very quickly, I actually, in my work, don't try to qualify the term openness because for the following reason. In the current historiographical interpretations of this time period, there is definitely a political division I'm seeing in the way historians interpret this, whether it's a manifestation of openness or not. And what I am seeing is that those scholars that okay, I'm not going to go actually in this, but I mean, to me, this is very controlled openness, right? I mean, that's why we have the semi-permeable Iron Curtain as the topic of this workshop. I mean, it's very controlled, it's very elite driven, and they are people with vested interest. And I here actually am very much a fan of Jeremy Suri's interpretation of detente as a conservative reaction against 1968, which leads to the convergence of elites between East and West who were willing to converse in order to consolidate their power through this conservative reaction. So he interprets detente as a conservative reaction. And I think this fits, in the Bulgarian case, the position of Bulgarian communist elites, who were both trying to orchestrate a limited opening, but also to tightly control, who can take advantage of this opening. And as far as going to the West was concerned, this was very highly controlled, sort of like process. That is connected to the dissident question for sure. Now, Bulgaria doesn't have the same sort of like dissident networks as Hungary, both internally and outside of the country. But 1978 was the year of the assassination of Georgy Markov. So that was very much on the mind of Bulgarian functionaries as they were orchestrating this event, because Bulgaria gained notoriety with the Bulgarian umbrella and whatnot. So that was very much on the mind. In my book, I have a whole chapter on the interaction between emigres and Bulgarian officials. And if you want, to refer to that chapter, the book is available open access, so you can find it for free on the everywhere. You can email me too, and I can send you the link. But there I am showing also that what's interesting is that, for example, so many intellectuals went to the West, but very few defections, very few. Like they are like a total of 3 defections. And that is different from the Soviet Union, where during this time period, you have a lot of defections, but the Bulgarians are not defecting. And that is curious, and that has to do with the nature of the dissident movement in Bulgaria, which is, much more controlled again for various reasons. And I'll stop here to give. I'm happy to continue this conversation. I can even stay on during the break if Peter wants to talk more, but I want to be mindful of the time.
Okay, I was also addressed by the question, so perhaps I would emphasize other layers. As far as I could well understand, there was a so the question also affected whether there was a regional competition between these countries to achieve the acknowledgement of the West. So somehow they were not co-players, teammates, but rather rivals. I did not really feel this part very much in the sources. So all players wanted to pursue their own national culture in some way in the West. And it's important that in the West, these countries in these bilateral relationships and other forms try to show the best for the West, as Theodora put it on one slide. So as a consequence, for the socialist world remained the rest. The quality of products, cultural products shown in the West, I guess, was higher than offered either on bilateral relations or other multilateral relations to the socialist world. And it had a negative consequence as importing from the Western culture also the best, because they had a wide choice of selection, control mechanisms. So the most progressive and, if entertainment, the best could remain. This lifted up the prestige of Western cultural products because, for example, speaking about films, you had to choose 60 films or 80 films from the Western world from 3,000. And from socialist cinema, you had about 300, 400 films, but you had to choose 100. So much less chance for quality selection. And this had a bias in itself. About dissident groups, I would say the Hungarian society living in Western countries was very various. And there was a part of them who could work as builders of networks, as agents of Hungarian culture as well. So helping to promote Hungarian poetry in France, to organize art exhibitions in the USA, or, for example, people working on university departments, Finno-Ugor departments, for example, had an important role in providing opportunities, even for state diplomacy as well, to be present or to build contacts.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.